Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You know me, and you might know this man too. We've got Tony Gale. Welcome back, Tony. Been a while. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing wonderful. It's a relatively beautiful day in New York City, I would say. Wouldn't you agree?
It's getting to be the 1 week that is my favorite time of year where it pretends to be fall.
That's a good way to put it. It's that meme where, you know, at the beginning of the day, it's kind of like winter, the afternoon, it's summer, the PM time is fall. We're in a mix of seasons right now. So welcome back. We're happy to see you again. I know it's been a while. For some of you, you've had an opportunity to see Tony in person, which has been very nice. Tony's done some photo walks in person, which was great, but now he's back with us virtually, which is great as well, because he's going to be talking about intro to photography. So this will be part 1 of the series. He's talking intro to types of cameras and lenses. So huge thanks to our sponsors over at Sony for sponsoring the event. If you do have any questions about cameras or lenses, now would be the opportune time to get them in. So if you're joining us here on Zoom, you can use the Q&A tab. If you're joining us on Vimeo or Facebook, you can use the comment section. But otherwise, Tony, I know you're always right on the dot. I know you like to finish right on the dot, right on time.
I do my best.
Yeah, you do a great job, but I want to give you all the time so that you don't have to feel rushed. So take it away. Thanks for being here. I'll see you back.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. I'm a commercial photographer based here in New York City. Some of you, as Scott mentioned, have probably seen me present stuff with B&H and Sony before. Today, I'm going to be going over part 1 of our Intro to Photography series, talking about cameras and lenses. In addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, I'm also a BenQ ambassador and Manfrotto ambassador in X-Rite Colorado, in case any of those brands come up. And since this is part 1, part 4, part 3, and part 2 are October 20th, November 1st, and November 15th, camera basics, composition, and lighting. And as always, I want to thank Sony for having me. Without Sony and the B&H event space, I wouldn't be here. So thank you very much to Sony. I like to always start my talks by talking about how fortunate we are to be doing photography now. This is a self-portrait I did on very dusty film with a manual focus camera that 30 years ago, maybe? No, not 30, 25 years ago. I had to hand process this film. Then I had to print it. I had to buy paper. I had to wait to see what I got. What we can do now with the technology we have with digital, where autofocus isn't that new technology, but everything else is incredible. It's a great time to be a photographer. So one of the things that often comes up with many of us who are into photography, professional or not, is people say, what camera should I buy? There's a lot of questions that go into that. Maybe you are thinking about buying a new camera. I'm going to go over some of the things to consider, some of what to look for. Obviously, I'm a Sony artisan. Sony is sponsoring this, so I'm going to be talking about Sony cameras specifically. But a lot of what I'm talking about today is applicable beyond just Sony. When I talk about focal length or full frame versus APS-C, that's true with any brand of camera. Sure, I love Sony cameras. I think they're the best for many, many people. But we'll still love you if you shoot something else. Nothing is perfect for everybody. So I'll be going over what camera should you buy, or should I buy? Camera types, sensor types, lens types, and differences. In rough strokes, that's what we're going over. So somebody comes up to you, or maybe it's you, and says, I want to buy a camera. What camera should I buy? There's a lot available out there. You've got things like the Alpha 7 IV. You've got a CyberShot point and shoot for $100. You've got some vlogging cameras. You've got an Alpha 1 for $6,500. There's a lot of things available to you, and it can be a little overwhelming when you just look at, here's a list of cameras. What one should I buy? Should I buy the cheapest one? to be honest, probably not. You probably shouldn't buy that $100 point and shoot. But maybe it's the right camera for you. You never know. Should you buy the most expensive, the Alpha 1? Maybe, but it's not the right camera for everybody. It just depends on what your needs are. So the answer to what camera should you buy is it depends. Starting with the low ends. So this is looking for Sony cameras on the B&H website. Every screenshot from the B&H website, all pricing is from yesterday. So if yesterday being Tuesday, September 27th, 2022. So if you're looking at this any other day other than yesterday, which you aren't because it's the day after yesterday, these prices may or may not be the same. You're going to have to look and see for yourself. Some prices may go up, some prices may go down. But at the low end, you've got a couple of cyber shots, point and shoot cameras. Those may be better for you than your phone. There's some limitations because there aren't a lot of updates with this cheaper point and shoots. You've got things like the A6000, excuse me, the RX0, ZV-10. There's a whole lot of stuff out there. And then if you look at the high end, doing a reverse search with high to low, you can get an Alpha 1 with a 12-24 GM lens and a grip for $10,000. Great camera, great lens. Grip is awesome. Is it right? I don't know. And then in the middle, you've got Alpha 7 R4. You've got the Alpha 7 III. You've got the RX1 R2. You've got the Alpha 7 III. There's a lot of stuff out there. So again, it still depends. It depends on what you want to shoot. So let's start with camera types and what's out there. In general, you have cameras that are your phone. We all have a phone. You have a point and shoot. You have a bridge camera. You have specialty cameras. You have DSLR/SLT interchangeable lens cameras, and you have mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras. We're going to go over what all that means and those specifics. To start with your phone, we all have a phone in our pocket. You can get something like the Xperia. I actually do use an Xperia phone. It has a great app for photography. It will let me shoot RAW. It's a great tool for pictures, and it's a good phone. I have the Pro I coming. The Pro I has a larger sensor, and we'll get into sensor size in a little bit, but it's got a larger sensor than your average phone, so that should correlate to better image quality. When you're looking at a phone, you may see that some phones have 3 lenses on the back. I don't know if you can see that. Some phones have 1. Typically, they're roughly equivalent to a super wide angle, a wide angle, and a standard to moderate zoom. So to give you a sense, on my Xperia 5 Mark II, it's got a 70mm equivalent, a 24mm equivalent, a 16mm equivalent. I say equivalent because when you're talking about cameras or devices that do not have removable lenses, usually people refer to it, and I'll mention this again later, in 35mm equivalent focal lengths. So what that means is someone will say, my Xperia 5 Mark II has a 16mm lens, a 24mm lens, and a 70mm lens. That's not specifically accurate. It just helps people conceptualize what that means, because the focal length and the sensor size go together to give you an equivalent field of view. So for example, the 16mm on my Xperia 5 Mark II is actually a 2.7mm. It's just because the sensor is small, the 2.7mm gives the equivalent field of view of a 16mm on a full frame 35. 24 is 5.1, 70 is 7mm. If you open up the files in something like Lightroom or Photoshop and look at the EXIF data, you can see all that. But your phone, it's always with you. It's great to have. It's not without its limitations. If you're going to try and do strobes, There's some strobes that will sort of sync with a phone, but nothing serious. It's a smaller sensor. It may be slower. It's great because it's always there. It's probably not going to be the thing that's your always camera. Then we have things like a point and shoot. So we've got the aforementioned $100 CyberShot. This is probably going to have a larger sensor than the phone, as I mentioned. So the image quality should be a little bit better, depending on how new your phone is and how old the point and shoot is. It has an optical zoom. So this has an optical zoom of the equivalent of 26 to 130 millimeters. So everything in between. Most phones have single focal length lenses. One of the newer Sonys does have a little bit of a zoom. But an optical zoom allows you to get, if you want 35 millimeters, you can get it. If you want 50, you can get it, because that's all between 26 and 130 millimeters. So that should give you a little bit better quality. The disadvantage is this one in particular. If you're going to shoot video, not great. It's still going to have some of the limitations with strobe and things. It's not going to be as fast. The new Xperias are probably faster than this, but this is $100. If you've got $100, then that's all you've got. There you go. Then you can get into a point and shoot like the RX100 series. These cameras I absolutely love. I've had an RX100 camera since they came out. I had the first one, the RX100. I had the RX100 III. I had the RX100 5, and now I have the RX100 6. I do not have the RX100 7. This is an amazing point and shoot. It's a 1-inch sensor. The 6 and the 7 have the equivalent of a 24 to 200 millimeter zoom. So huge amount of range. They can shoot 4K video. They're small and pocketable. It's always in my bag or in my pocket. It's a great point and shoot. It's not replacing my bigger cameras, but as a walking around camera, I absolutely love it. And there's a wide range of prices. So the newest, the 7, $1,300. The older versions that are still available are cheaper. And to give you an idea of what that range, that 24 to 200 millimeter equivalent is, this is from the roof of the apartment I live in Brooklyn. So on the left, 24 millimeter equivalent, which is 9 millimeters because it's a 1-inch sensor. We talked about lens equivalents earlier, and I'll keep bringing it up. On the right, 72 millimeters, which is the equivalent of a 200 millimeter lens. That's a huge range to have in a little tiny point and shoot camera. It's absolutely incredible. And it gives you excellent quality because it's an optical zoom. Then you have something like a bridge camera. A bridge camera bridges the pro world and the point and shoot world. It does a little bit of both. It's not all pro. It's not all point and shoot. Although I do want to say, when people say things like pro, that's subjective, right? There are pros that use anything. There are pros that use their phones. It's not the tool that makes you a pro. It's being a pro that makes you a pro. But for our purposes, we're still going to talk about a pro camera. So something like the RX10 Mark IV, it's the same sensor as the RX100 series. It's a bigger body. It shoots faster. The autofocus is faster. This has the equivalent of a 24 to 600 millimeter lens, which is a huge range. If you were someone who is, maybe you were going on safari and you only wanted a camera for that one trip, or you're going on an Alaskan cruise and you want to be able to photograph animals or whales from the boat, but also the big vistas, and you don't want to bring a bunch of stuff, the RX10 Mark IV might be the answer. It's a relatively small camera, good image quality, 1-inch sensor, huge zoom range, really a fantastic tool. And for someone that just doesn't want to fuss with a lot of things, maybe that's the answer. It'll shoot raw, it can shoot full manual, you can control everything. You can do that on the RX100 series as well. You can do manual focus. It'll do many of the things that a interchangeable lens camera will do. It just doesn't have an interchangeable lens. Then you have things like specialty cameras. So something like the RX0 Mark II, which is a little tiny camera. It's a little bit like an action cam, but it's not an action cam. It's waterproof, it's drop proof to a point. It'll capture 4K video, you can capture stills. It also has a 1-inch sensor, which is incredible for such a small camera. Typically action cams have itty bitty sensors. This has a 1-inch sensor. This might be something you would use as a crash cam. Maybe you put it on, strap it to the underside of a car, put it on a surfboard, anything like that, where you need a camera that's robust to capture angles that would be difficult for a larger camera. And another specialty camera might be something like the ZV-1 or the ZV-E10, which are really designed for vlogging. If you're someone that wants to do a lot of vlogging, YouTube vlogging, they have flip forward screens, has a tally light on the front so that when you're recording video, the light's on and you know it's recording. It comes with that little mic. It's designed for someone to hold at arm's length and vlog with. So it's a specialty camera. It also does a lot of the same things as the RX100 series. It's the same 1-inch sensor. It's built with a lot of the same features. And then it's got the features that are more vlogging specific. And then something like the ZV-E10 is an APS-C camera with removable lenses, but some of the same features. There's also, and I'm just going to mention it, the DSLR or SLT. SLT was what Sony cameras became after they were SLRs, like the Alpha 99 and the Alpha 99 II and the 77 and 77 II were SLT cameras, which meant that there was a mirror, like DSLRs have a mirror. It's a single lens reflex. I just realized it. I said the LSR. DSLR is digital single lens reflex. The mirror flips up. With an SLT, the mirror doesn't flip up. So light goes through the mirror to the sensor. So it's a little faster, it's quieter. At this point, in real terms, you should probably not look, if you're looking to buy a new camera, don't look at a DSLR, just look at mirrorless. Everybody, every manufacturer, almost without exception, there's always an exception, is putting their R&D and their focus into mirrorless. Mirrorless is like a DSLR, except there's no mirror. There's no mirror box. It's one fewer things to go wrong. And they tend to have features that when there's a mirror, it's not great. So the focus doesn't use the mirror like a DSLR typically does. It focuses off the sensor itself. They're typically better for video. They're better at what you see is what you get. So if you change your exposure or your color, you can see that. All the technology is going that way. I've been shooting mirrorless, I don't know, 6 years, 7 years. That's the way to go. So to start with, mirrorless camera, there's APS-C, something like the Alpha A6400, which is a relatively small mirrorless camera. It's got an APS-C sensor, which is a smaller sensor. We'll talk about sensor size in a bit. It's a little cheaper because it's smaller. It takes smaller lenses, but tons of features. It can do 4K video, 24 megapixels. Then you have something like the Alpha 7 IV, which is a very new camera, a very excellent camera. It's a full frame sensor, 33 megapixels, 4K 60 video, 10 frames a second, can take full frame lenses. Great camera. Alpha 7S III, designed more for video. Typically, the S in Alpha 7S III stands for sensitivity. It's a 12 megapixel sensor. It's a smaller sensor in terms of resolution, which allows for more light gathering in each photo site, which should give you cleaner low light images. And as video, it's excellent. I have one that I use for video. Something like the Alpha 7 III, 24 megapixels. So the Alpha 7 IV was the successor to this, but they're both still available. The Alpha 7 III is one of the best-selling mirrorless cameras of all time. I think it's the best-selling full-frame mirrorless camera of all time. It's an excellent camera. Something like the Alpha 1. We'll talk about some of the differences of all these, but You can see I purchased this camera on February 15th, 2021. I just noticed that. The Alpha 1, 50 megapixels. So it's double the resolution of something like the 6400 or the 7.3. 8K video, can do 30 frames a second in electronic shutter, can do raw video, focus is crazy fast, better weather sealing. As you spend more money, you typically get better weather sealing, a more robust body. So if it gets banged up, it's going to last better. It'll typically have faster autofocus, a faster processor in there. All of that comes into play. So you're overwhelmed. You saw a bunch of cameras. You don't know what you want to do. It comes down to what kind of photos do you want to take? Sports, portraits, street, travel, architecture, animals, events, everything. I think many people, when they're starting out, don't know what they want to photograph. Maybe everything. When I started out, people said specialize. I don't want to specialize. There's too many cool things to photograph. And to be honest, there are a lot of cool things to photograph. Even I think people that specialize, like I primarily shoot people in portraits. I still shoot other things for fun, and you should. So if you want to photograph sports, you want to think about something that's fast. So something with a high frame rate, something that focuses quickly, something that can track. So for example, this is the Alpha 1 at 30 frames a second. For sports where something's happening quickly, it's difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to time the moment exactly. So, you know, you're watching the football game, you're trying to time that catch. You see the catch, you hit the shutter, and you just missed it because you hit the shutter after you saw the catch. When you can shoot at 30 frames a second, when you know the catch is close, you just start shooting. You got 30 frames a second, and you're going to get something where the ball is falling into the receiver's hands or bouncing off his hands, depending, or hers. 30 frames a second makes it easier to make sure you get the shot. I mean, you can see with this, you started early, I ended late. Most of these are not the shot I would want, but in there, you get the thing that is great. So if you look, third from the left, third one down, you've got these two gentlemen on city bikes. Both bikes are completely within the frame. Neither of them are cropped out. If I tried to time that as they're going by, almost impossible. To give you an idea, here's the same camera, 15 frames per second instead of 30. And you can see half the number of frames in that amount of time, a lot harder to get the timing you want. And then you get down even lower. Very, very difficult. So if you're shooting sports, a high frame rate is important. Something like this, high frame rate, fast autofocus, jets move fast even when they're far away. But maybe you're going to photograph something that's not moving, something like these. Then maybe something like Alpha 7R4, Alpha 7.3, maybe that's the answer. You don't necessarily need speed for something that's not moving. Maybe you're photographing architecture, maybe you're photographing portraits. There's a lot more flexibility. If you're photographing a wedding, for example, lots of wedding photographers like the Alpha 7.3 and the Alpha 7.4. Why that over the Alpha 7R4? The R4 has higher resolution, which can be great, but it also means that you have bigger files. Maybe you don't want to shoot 3,064, 61 megapixel files. I do that on a daily basis, but not everybody wants to. Maybe a 24 megapixel camera is appropriate. It just depends on what you need. So knowing that and thinking about what you want, when you're looking at a camera, go onto the specs online. If you go into the B&H website, go to the camera you want to see and just click on the box that says specs. You can pull it up and you can start looking and see specifically what's available. So it will tell you things like, is there a crop factor? If it's full frame, there isn't. If there's APS-C, there is. It will tell you bit depth. Everything should be pretty much 14-bit at this point. It will tell you things like the ISO range. With the Alpha 6100, for example, the extended range is 100 to 51,200. With the Alpha 1, it's 50 to 102,400. The Alpha 1 can do an 8,000th of a second in mechanical shutter. The Alpha 6100 can do 4,000. The Alpha 1 can do 32,000 in electronic shutter. All of that information is there for you to see. And then you can get down into things like continuous shooting. How fast is it? The 6100 will do 11 frames a second, which is really quite fast. It could be the answer for you. The Alpha 1 can do 30 frames a second. You can get into things like video recording. Do you want 8K? Do you want 4K? Do you need 4K 120? Do you need 4K 24? For those of you who don't know what that means, you probably don't need any of it right now. So take a look at the specs once you know what kind of camera and what kind of thing you're thinking about. Then you've got sensor types. Old digital cameras had CCDs. Pretty much nothing now is CCD. Then there's CMOS, there's stacked CMOS, and there's backside illuminated CMOS. Everything now is CMOS, basically. Stacked CMOS and backside illuminated CMOS are faster. So a stacked CMOS has processing stuff built into the sensor, so it's faster. So when you're shooting quickly, it processes the files more quickly. Backside illuminated CMOS moves where some of the hardware on the sensor is to the back so that more light gets to the photodiodes. Essentially, it's newer technology that's better. Then you get into, let's talk about sensor sizes. So I've mentioned it a little bit, full frame APS-C 1-inch. What that is the physical size of the sensor. So a full frame sensor, people say full frame, what they mean is full frame 35 millimeter film. So when you had a 35 millimeter film camera, your negative was 24 millimeters by 36 millimeters. That's full frame. APS-C, it depends a little bit on the manufacturer, but with Sony, it's a 1.5x crop. 1 inch is smaller, a 2/3 sensor is smaller, a 1/2.5 sensor is smaller. You can get a sense of it. Your typical phone is a 1/2.5 or maybe a 2/3. That's much, 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 much smaller than full frame. If you have a lot of light, that could be okay. In the dark, probably less so. Then you've got things like resolution. So I mentioned maybe you photograph weddings and you don't want to necessarily fill up all your cards and all your hard drives. This is a file that's at 12.4 megapixels, 21 megapixels, 50 megapixels, 200 megapixels. 200 megapixels is with pixel shift, which is a feature that the Alpha 7R3, Alpha 7R4, and Alpha 1 have, where it stitches together multiple files. Looking on your screens right now at these, you probably, except for I forgot to bring up the shadows on this one, you probably don't see much of a difference, right? 12 megapixels for the size of your computer screen is probably fine. You're not going to see a huge difference between even the 12 and the 200 in terms of image quality if it's on your phone, if it's on your laptop. However, to give you an idea of what those differences are, so these are the relative sizes, 12.4 on the upper left, 21, 50, 200. You can see there's a lot more information in a 200 megapixel file. So if you want to do something like zoom in, so maybe you photograph sports and you are shooting wide and you want to zoom in to make sure you get the shot, or you photograph wildlife and you're trying to track the bird, and if you zoom in too tight, you lose it, or it's just too far away. That's where higher resolution really, really can matter. It can also matter if you need to blow it up big. But so this is a 12 megapixel crop taken out of the 200 megapixel file. That's how much you can zoom in, and then you have the same information as the 12. That's a huge difference. If you had a bird flying by and you had a bigger file, you can zoom in. I've also done things where I've needed to print images 8 feet high. I want all the resolution I can get. But it's subjective. Not everybody needs that. Not everybody wants that. I see people all the time, as there's always speculation about what's coming and higher resolution and all that. Every resolution I've ever seen, someone says this is all you need. Nobody needs any more. And then when it comes out, people still want it. I want all the resolution I can get. All right. We thought about cameras. Now we have lens types. There's APS-C versus full frame. There's focal length. There's zooms or primes. There's autofocus or manual focus. There's G Master G, Sony Zeiss, Sony, and there's adapted lenses. So let's talk about focal lengths first. We did talk about it a little. Lenses are measured in millimeters, and it's the distance of the front element to essentially where the focal plane is, more or less. So a longer lens zooms in more. 200 millimeters zooms in, 12 millimeters is wide. Like we mentioned before, on cameras, they don't have removable lenses. They almost always use 35 millimeter equivalents. APS-C cameras with removable lenses do not. So we'll talk about what that difference is in a minute. To give you an idea of the difference, that same rooftop in Brooklyn, on the left, 12 millimeter lens. On the right, my 200 to 600 Sony G with a 2x extender, so 1200 millimeters. If you look really, 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 really close at the picture on the left, you might just barely be able to see the Empire State Building there on the horizon. And then at 1200 millimeters, there it is right in front of you with some atmospheric haze and some heat. You can see it's not sharp. That's not the lens. That's just the stuff in the atmosphere. There's a huge amount of range. That's on full frame. You get to APS-C, because APS-C has a crop essentially, which means that 12 millimeters is not as wide because you're cropping into it on APS-C as it is on full frame. But conversely, 1200 millimeters is longer on full frame because you're cropping in. So a 12 millimeter lens on a Sony APS-C camera is roughly equivalent to an 18 millimeter lens on full frame, and a 1200 millimeter lens on an APS-C camera, roughly equivalent to an 1800 millimeter lens. So if you want to shoot big, wide vistas, APS-C may not be the answer for you. But if you want to photograph birds or something very, very far away, APS-C may be the answer. You can, of course, as we discussed with resolution, always zoom in and crop anyway, but it's something to think about. Also with focal length, the focal length and the distance to your subject impact how it looks. So this is my friend Michelle, excellent photographer I share an office with. All the settings on the camera are the same. The only difference is that I use 2 different focal lengths. You can see his head is roughly the same size as the frame, but that wider focal length on the left and the longer focal length on the right have a very different impact. So on the left, you can see it's 12 millimeters. On the right, it's 105 millimeters. Of those 2, I prefer the 105. I think the 12 is way too distorted. You may disagree. Maybe you like the distortion. I think in general, people like myself, photographers, people that are talking and teaching who say things in absolutes too much, are oversimplifying things. You can take a portrait of anyone with any lens. In general, people will say you want 50 or 70 or 105, depending on what you're doing. 70 to 135 is probably the sweet spot for most people, but it depends on what you want and what you're trying to do. If all you have is a 12-millimeter lens, then use a 12-millimeter lens. So to give you a little bit more of a sense of the difference, starting on the upper left and reading down, you got 12, 18, 24, 35, 50, 70, 105, 135, 200. And then the zoom thing is covering it, so I can't see on the right, but 300 and 400. So it's quite a difference between those. You can see once even you start getting to 24, he starts looking like a normal person. And then you get 70, 105, 135. It's a much more flattering angle. But it not only impacts the subject here in this portrait, it also impacts the background. And the reason it does that is because you're seeing less of the background. It's cropping in tighter. So everything gets compressed and you're seeing less extraneous stuff. For this to work, with his head roughly the same size, but different focal lengths, he stays in the same place, but I have to physically move. The camera can't stay in the same spot, have him in the same spot, change lenses and get this effect. What would happen is you get closer and closer and closer to him and be, zooming in on his nose. So physically I have to move, which has an impact on how the lens resolves and shows you what's in the frame. Similar thing here, 200 millimeters, 12 millimeters. Doing the same thing, you can see moving further away, you get more and more of a field of view, even keeping that orange pylon roughly the same size. You can do things like this with a 12 millimeter. You need something super wide for that kind of effect. You want the sun nice and big. At sunset, at dusk, 400 millimeters. This is 2470 GM at 24. Same spot, same night at 70. Which one's better? Depends on what you like. So we talked about crop factor a little bit with small sensors, APS-C. To get roughly the equivalent of the APS-C on the right with the full frame on the left, really I'd be at 100, I'd be at 600, but I was ballparking it. But you can see 400 millimeters on APS-C is roughly the equivalent of 600 millimeters on full frame. That's what the crop factor is. 12 millimeters on the top, full frame, 12 millimeters on the bottom, APS-C, 1200 on the top, full frame, 1200 millimeters, the bottom, APS-C. You can see the difference. It's the same lens, but because the sensor is a different size, you're getting less of the information. Something like this, photographing at a Padres game, using a 300 millimeter lens on a 6300, which is a crop sensor camera. It's an APS-C camera. I get to zoom in closer. I'm bringing this up again because it's important. Phones and point and shoots typically use full frame equivalents on the lens. All right. So you're thinking about APS-C, you're thinking about full frame. One of the questions I see a lot is, if I buy an APS-C lens, can I put it on a full frame body and vice versa? You can. There are some potential issues. So full frame lens on an APS-C camera, no problem. There will be people that will argue you get better quality with an APS-C lens. I have not experienced that. APS-C lens on a full frame body, it works, but with caveats. So if you have a Sony camera and you put an APS-C lens on a full frame camera, it will by default crop in so that you're getting the equivalent of an APS-C camera out of it. Unless you turn that feature off, you won't even know it's happening. There are some lenses, like the Sony 10 to 18 APS-C lens, that if you put it on full frame, like on the left, it kind of works. You can see there's some vignetting, the little black edges on the left. It can kind of work, but you're going to have to crop in. It's full frame on the left, APS-C on the right. Same lens at 10 millimeters, a lot more vignetting on the left. Obviously on the APS-C on the right, there's no vignetting. This is what happens when you turn that feature off, so it doesn't automatically crop. Then you get something like the 16 to 50 APS-C lens, dramatic vignetting, like dramatic at 50 millimeters on the left, APS-C on the right. So APS-C lenses will work on full frame, but there's some limitations. Full frame lenses on APS-C are just functionally the same. They work fine. If you're looking at buying new gear and you think you want to go full frame at some point, but right now you have an APS-C, I would encourage you to look at buying full frame lenses, because when you eventually go full frame, you'll already have the full frame lenses. It's kind of a bummer to have a bunch of APS-C lenses and then convert to full frame and not be able to get the most out of that camera. But if you think APS-C is all you need, and it may well be, then APS-C is fine. So then we have zooms versus primes. So to give you an idea of zooming, there you go. That's a big, nice, long zoom. A zoom lens just changes focal length, right? We're all familiar with what a zoom lens does. You can look here, 24, 105 on the top, 24, 28, 35, 40, 50, 85, and 90 on the bottom. So zoom lens on the top and 7 prime lenses on the bottom to get the same focal lengths that one on the top has, plus we're still missing 105. You might look at that and say, well, the zoom is the answer, and it might be, but it depends on what you're trying to do. The advantage of a zoom is the flexibility. The newer Sony zooms are excellent. They're very sharp. There was a time when a zoom lens was typically not sharp. A prime lens was way better. You would use a zoom because you had to, but anytime you could, you'd use prime because it was faster. I'm sorry, it was sharper. The Sony zoom lenses are excellent, especially the G Masters. Very, very sharp. What they aren't is as fast. And by fast, I mean the f-stop and how much light it lets in. So the 24 to 105, which I have and I love, I actually have all of these lenses. Great lens. It's an f4. It's a straight f4. So it lets in f4 worth of light. When you get something like the 35 1.8, we're going to talk more about f-stops and the next one of these. It lets in a stop and a third more light. It lets in dramatically more light. So you can photograph when it's darker, or you can get a faster shutter speed. There's a lot more flexibility to it. And they're also typically smaller physically than a zoom lens. So what the answer is for you, hard to say. I use both. There are times I use zoom lenses. There are times I use prime lenses. They both serve their purposes, and those purposes can be different. Then you have autofocus versus manual focus lenses. I'm going to make this one easy. Just get autofocus. When I was starting out, I thought, I don't need auto anything. I'll do manual focus all the time. I don't need auto on my camera. Autofocus is magic, especially the eye autofocus that's available to us now. If you want manual focus, you can just turn the autofocus off on your autofocus lens, but you are limiting yourself a lot if you buy a lens that's only manual focus. People do. If you love it, you love it. That's fine. So then we also have within Sony some different lens types. There's Sony G Master, there's Sony G and Sony Zeiss, which are roughly the same in tier, and then just Sony. Sony G Master lenses are designed to be future-proof. They have better weather sealing. They're more robust. They're better built. They typically focus faster. They may have a faster aperture. They're just a higher quality, better built lens, but you have to pay for that, right? You can't get the filet mignon for the price of hamburger. Sony G and Sony Zeiss are still pro tier lenses. They're still excellent lenses, and all of these can be excellent lenses. But they're not as future-proof. It's one rung down. And then if it just says Sony, can still be an excellent lens. The Sony 85 1.8. It's not G or G Master or Sony Zeiss. Excellent lens. One of my favorites. One of the best lenses per dollar that's made, I think. Fantastic lens. But it just depends on what you need. So part of the idea of G Master is resolution is improving. And so they were designed to still be good as resolution improves. One of the things I have found with older lenses, maybe you have a lens from the 80s or even the 90s, those lenses typically, they were designed for 35 millimeter film, and most of them don't hold up with high resolution digital now. They're just not sharp enough. They were sharp enough for film because film wasn't that sharp, but digital is so much higher quality than 35 millimeter film that a newer, better lens makes a difference. I have some really top tier manual focus vintage glass, and I compare it to my modern Sony glass, and it's nowhere near as sharp. It's fun and it's cool, but it's not the same. You also run into situations like this where we have a lot of 50 millimeter lenses. This is 51.2, the 51.4, the 51.8, 52.5, a different 51.8, a third 51.8, a 55 1.8 Z, and a 52.8 macro. There's 8 Sony 50 millimeter lenses out there. The pricing varies because they all are different. So you have the 51.2 G Master on the upper right. It's going to focus the fast, excellent weather sealing. I have that lens. I love it. You have the 51.4 Sony Zeiss. Very good lens. You have the 51.8 for $248. You may look and say, what's the difference between a 1.8 for $248 and a 1.2 for $2,000? Focus speed, build quality, just weather sealing. So if dust or moisture is less likely to get in, all of those things come into play. Also, the difference between 1.8 and 1.2 is actually quite a lot. The 52.5, it's physically smaller. The 250 1.8s on the lower left are APS-C lenses. So they're E, not FE. With Sony, FE is full frame E. E is APS-C. The 55 1.8 Zeiss, Sony Zeiss, excellent lens. I have that too. And then the 52.8 macro. Macro allows you to focus closer and so make small things larger. They all serve a different purpose. There's a lot of 50s, but there's different 50s for different people based on their needs. If you can afford it, the G Master is great. If what you want is the $250 1.8, that's great too. There's also adapted lenses, which I'm just briefly going to mention. Adapted lenses are something that with a mirrorless camera, Sony mirrorless in particular, almost any lens ever made for any camera can be adapted to put on your Sony mirrorless. So I have an old Minolta manual focus lens here with a adapter, a tilt shift adapter, so I can twist it and do funky things. I can get a lens from the 30s and put it on a Sony camera. I can get a lens from the 80s. You can take the lens that your grandfather had that's been sitting in the attic collecting dust and put it on your new Sony camera. Again, those lenses generally, they're not going to be as sharp and they're not going to have autofocus. And if you go with a newer, say a third-party brand, you can get adapters for Sony cameras, but you may lose some features. Autofocus may not be as fast. It may not do 30 frames a second, for example. Sometimes you lose some features, but you can absolutely do it. And I encourage people who are making a jump from one brand to Sony or to think about whatever the lens is that they use the most and buy that in Sony. And then over time, depending on your budget, you can replace the others, but get an adapter in the meantime. Adapted lenses can absolutely be done. It's a cool thing. It's fun. It is not going to be the same as native glass. With all that, what camera and lens should you buy? It still depends. You know, take a look at your budget, see what you can spend. Don't go into huge amounts of debt. I was told when I was younger, buy the best equipment you can afford. And I think as a professional, that's true. But what everyone can afford is different. And what is appropriate for you is different. Someone telling you that you are not a real photographer because you don't have the camera that they think that you should have is probably someone you shouldn't listen to. If the camera works for you, it's the right answer. Take a look at what makes sense. Go into B&H, put your hands on it, see what you think. There's a lot of different options out there. There's APS-C, there's the ZV-E10, the RX0, maybe the RX10 Mark IV. There's a lot of lens options. Same thing. Think about what makes sense for you. Think about what you can afford. Don't go into huge amounts of debt. Don't mortgage the house to buy a new camera, but buy something that's going to work and play with it and have fun. Next time we're going to go over settings, things like the exposure triangle, shutter speed, f-stop, all that stuff. But for now, I don't know. Do we have any questions?
We do have questions. I want to, first of all, say thank you, Tony. Great in-depth. I love that you touched on adaptive lenses or adapters for lenses. Jeez, man, it's rough. Get a couple days off and you can't speak anymore. But I think you hit on it. I mean, it's 52 minutes in. I'm going to wrap everything Tony said up into this. So if anybody wants to share this and just tell people to skip to the 52-minute mark. But I think he said it best, you know, whatever you have, the camera you have with you is the best camera to use. So whatever that may be, if it's a cell phone in your pocket, that's it. If you carry your camera around all the time, like a lot of photographers do, that's it. Use it. Like Tony said, don't go into debt. I remember back in the days, first getting into this, selling everything I owned, all of my possessions, just to buy that lens. So Tony, where were you then?
Well, but you didn't go into debt. You sold your stuff. So that's different.
I made sacrifices. You're right. You're right. I didn't go into debt, but I lost some things that maybe I would have liked to have now.
Paul Strand used to skip dinner so he could afford to make a platinum print. You know, making sacrifices because something is going to make your photography better. I think there's value to that.
Definitely. You know, if you could skip your
going into bankruptcy because you bought stuff you couldn't afford, don't do that.
Yeah, if you skip your mocha frappuccino, you'll be there in no time. And
right.
And for those who are interested in maybe going into a little bit of debt but paying it off, Payboo. We've got the Payboo card at B&H. So
I have a Payboo card.
Yeah, just make sure to pay it off. That's all. Don't let it sit there. So
it's a good way you save the tax.
Yeah.
Unless you're in one of those states without sales tax, it can save you a lot.
And if you are, let me know where you're at. I need to get out. No more sales tax. Vic is joining us on Facebook. Wanted to know, great question. Are there full frame mirrorless cameras without video capabilities?
There may have been early on, but to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing now. It is a thing I see on Facebook groups a lot. Somebody say, why am I paying for the video features when I don't want to shoot video? I think ultimately you'd probably be paying more for a camera that didn't have those features because it's cheaper for them to make one camera that has it all than to make a second body that that fewer people would buy without those. You know, if you don't want the video, you don't have to use it.
There you go.
But you should try it. You might like it. That's
it. Or, you know, check out the newly released FX30 from Sony, right?
Yes. APS-C, 4K video.
There you go. Check it out. It's nice. It looks cool. I got to get into the store and play with it myself. Going to ask you a question here, Tony. I know you've been with Sony for a long time, and I know you've been a Sony shooter for a really long time. You know, I'll date myself and say I remember the early days of Sony also. But going back in that career, what would you say your favorite Sony camera has been?
Well, it depends on the day, but now it's the Alpha 7 R4 or the Alpha 1 are my two favorites. Because every time they come out with something new, I keep thinking I don't need anything new, and then they come out with something that has features or capabilities that I didn't know I wanted that are absolutely incredible. I will say, however, that the vertical grip for the A850 and the A900 is the best feeling vertical grip I've ever seen. And I wish that they would make that for newer cameras.
Throwing it back. I like it. I like it. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because I was actually having a conversation with another photographer today about the Sony cameras. And I was saying I was kind of a late adopter to the Sony system because in the beginning, the colors were a little too warm for me. And I was like, I don't know. And now I love them. I love the colors. Like I can't get enough of them. It's not an endorsement. Okay. I'm not endorsing Sony over here. I'm just saying it took me a while, but I came around, you know. Peggy on Vimeo wanted to ask, do you have any recommendations if she's gonna be shooting the Milky Way? She's thinking about something like a 24. What would you recommend?
For astro in general, not the Milky Way specifically, I would actually go a little wider. I like the 20 and the 14. If you only want the Milky Way, the 24 is excellent. You know, it's less wide and the Milky Way is not the entire sky. So the 24 could be the answer. It's an excellent lens. The 24 GM is an excellent lens.
There you go. Or if you're local and you can come to the store, check them out, play with them, see what you like. There you go. Good option. Well, we'll see you back here October 20th. That's part 2. You mixed me up before. You went part 4 first, but that's gonna
Yeah.
be.
Well, you got to keep people on their toes.
You gotta make sure people are paying attention, are actually watching the webinars, right?
Absolutely.
That's it. I'm watching. I'm
There
paying
you go.
attention. So Tony will be talking about intro to camera basics. So make sure if you haven't already and you're interested in camera basics to go ahead to the B&H event space page. We've got it up already. You can go ahead and click on the link and you can add that to your calendar, Google Calendar, any of that stuff. This way it'll send you a reminder and you don't forget about it. As I like to say, and hopefully I don't get any trademark infringement here, but set it and forget it, right? Ron Popeil, everybody. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry, Google it. But Tony, I want to thank you again for being here, as well as Sony for sponsoring this event. Where can people find you, Tony?
Oh, you know what? I have a slide.
Oh,
Look at that.
Boom. There you go. Yeah. See, you didn't show your last slide.
I saw questions and I just froze.
You got so enticed on it. Well, beautiful. So thanks so much, Tony, for being here. Thanks everybody for joining us. That's all the time we have for tonight. We hope to see you back here on the 20th and obviously before then, but that's it for now. There's been another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We'll catch
Thanks,
you next
everybody.
time.